Hello, I'm Rich from Medieval History Buff. I would just like to thank you for watching my video, and I would just like to ask you to like, subscribe and comment. Every view, comment, like and subscribe I get is greatly appreciated, and my channel is growing even though it looks quite small at the moment with only 19 subscribers. It's growing quicker than I thought it would, because I thought it would take me years and years. But I do think my content is getting better, and I do genuinely appreciate all the views that I'm starting to get on the channel. I think my channel overall has had something like nearly 800 views, and obviously my video counts aren't that high, but I do appreciate all the views that I'm getting. So hopefully together we can grow this channel as time goes by. Now I hope you enjoy this video, and part 2 will be up within the next 24 to 48 hours. King Cerdic ruled over Wessex from 519 to 534. From the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, we can tell that King Cerdic spent much of his reign fighting, particularly against the Britons. In the year he succeeded to the Kingdom of Wessex, Cerdic, alongside Cynric, fought against the Britons at Cerdixford in modern Salisbury in their first major military encounter. 8 years later, Cerdic and his son Cynric again engaged the Britons, this time in Somerset, where they were victorious. In 530 they captured the Isle of Wight, and 4 years later, on the death of Cerdic, Cynric succeeded his father to the throne of Wessex. Cynric reigned as King of Wessex for a total of 26 years, and his career is most notable for his successes in battle, defeating the Britons most notably in 552. Unlike later kings, he seems to have been comfortable enough handing power to family, letting 2 of them rule over the Isle of Wight for him, which he had captured earlier on alongside his father. That's a quite notable gesture to relinquish power in those times, as he could have been creating potential rivals for his kingdom. He seems to have been confident enough in his own position and trusting enough of his family to be able to do that, and it proved to be a wise decision with good judgment, as stability reigned in his kingdom. Cynric had proved to be a strong and capable ruler. In the north, in 565, St. Columba was sent to convert the Picts to Christianity and built his monastery on Iona. In 568, the new king of Wessex, a man called Caelin, fought against the king of Kent, Athelbright, and defeated him in a skirmish. In 577, Caelin continued the Wessex success and captured 3 cities from the Britons: Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath. Although one of his allies was killed a few years later, Caelin continued his dominance and captured more and more towns, expanding his kingdom. His run, though, was to come to an end in 592, where he suffered heavy losses in a battle at a site in Wiltshire, and he was driven back. Caelin died 1 year later. Despite that defeat, he had continued Wessex's military successes and expanded the kingdom. In 597, probably the most significant event in early Anglo-Saxon history saw the arrival of Augustine in Britain to convert the pagan Saxon kingdoms. The first notable conversion was the King of Northumbria in 601. There seems to have been strong resistance among the Welsh in particular, to heed Augustine's message, and as a result, many were killed by Saxon tribes who were themselves converting. The Welsh continued to resist, and some 200 priests were killed when they were sent west to pray for the Welsh. Augustine died not long after this event, but thanks to him, there was now a church in Britain. He was buried at his abbey in Canterbury. In 617, Northumbria had a new king called Edwin, who seems to have been a formidable and strong king, as he defeated all the other major Saxon kingdoms except for Kent. After a failed assassination attempt on him, Edwin retaliated against Wessex, who he blamed for the assassination attempt, by launching a brutal attack on the Kingdom of Wessex and forced them into submission. After he himself was converted in 627, Edwin ruled for a further 6 years, before he and his heir were killed in battle. Edwin was a formidable warrior king and one of the strongest of his time, and he was an early forerunner to later Saxon kings who sought to unify the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Over the course of the next century, life continued in pretty much the same vein, with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fighting amongst themselves, with Kent in particular suffering extensive damage in the late 7th century. In 757, the most famous of all Anglo-Saxon kings before Alfred the Great, Offa became king of Mercia. Unsurprisingly, his route to the crown was not straightforward, and he had to fight to win it, before he eventually reigned for nearly 40 years. Offa's main legacy, and one of Anglo-Saxon England's most famous landmarks, Offa's Dyke, was built in around 780. It is probable, although not absolutely certain, that it was indeed built by King Offa. During the last few years of Offa's reign, a sense of foreboding began to sweep the land, and ominous signs were being spotted everywhere, and in 793 the foreboding became reality when the monastery at Lindisfarne was sacked. This was the beginning of 300 years of Viking raids. The Danes attacked again in 736 when they were victorious at the Battle of Carhampton. From where on in, the attacks became more and more sustained. The Vikings, though, were not entirely invincible, and they were driven back in 838, although that only proved to be temporary respite, and they were to come again. They gained several victories after that, although in 851 they suffered a couple of major setbacks as they sustained dramatic casualties in battles in the southwest. And when they were forced into retreat to Surrey, they were hammered again in battle by King Athelwold, the father of the future Alfred the Great. Athelwold is a key figure in Anglo-Saxon England, not least because of his success in battle, but because of the examples he set to his sons, in particular Alfred, and thanks in part to him, he set Alfred on the path to greatness, and Alfred would indeed change the course of English history through his own brilliance. And what we have seen is that although the Vikings were indeed mighty warriors, the Anglo-Saxons were very much capable of unifying against them, and not only driving them back, but inflicting heavy damage upon them. So the successes of kings like Alfred the Great, Athelstan, and Edward the Elder should not really come as a surprise. The examples had been set by the kings before Alfred the Great. In 865, the Vikings settled in England for the first time. Violence and pillaging continued all the same, however, and the famous story of King Edmund being tied to a tree and shot to death with a volley of arrows went down in history, though it is possibly exaggerated. Edmund was later made a saint. In 871, Alfred, alongside his brother Athelred, met the Vikings at the Battle of Ashdown, where they successfully defeated the Danes. Not long after the battle, Athelred died, and Alfred became King of Wessex. One thing that doesn't emerge from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is how widespread the Vikings' movement was. They did not leave one area of the country untouched. They moved swiftly from region to region, only halting when the winter weather set in. In 878, the Vikings marched into Wessex and overran it. In response, Alfred roused the men of Hampshire, Wiltshire, and Somerset, and together they forced the Vikings to retreat. After they were hunted down and besieged by Alfred's forces, the Vikings left Wessex after their king had been baptized. The following years went in much the same way. The Danes marched from place to place, with the Saxons scrambling to respond. In 882, Alfred engaged them in a sea battle where he wiped out the Danish forces by sinking their ships and killing their fighters. His feats against the Danes were not the only reason Alfred became known as the Great. He was a big believer in education and had books translated from Latin to English for the benefit of the general population. It was also thanks to him that the main source for our knowledge of the Anglo-Saxon period, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, was compiled. In 893, the Saxons and Danes were again engaged in battle, this time at Farnham, and again Alfred's men put them to flight and stole their provisions. Time and again, Alfred forced the Vikings to retreat. He built defensive structures known as burhs, mimicking the Danes in that regard. He even built the first real English navy, although his main successes remained on land. When he died in 899, at the age of somewhere between 50 and 56, he left behind a legacy of young, educated noblemen who had been schooled thanks to his patronage. He had put in place a network of defensive structures to enable his son and successor to continue to defy the Vikings and unify what would become now known as England. He had encouraged literacy throughout the general English population, and thanks to him, we have the Chronicle, which shines a light on his deeds on an otherwise distant and murky time. On the death of his father, Alfred, Edward the Elder succeeded as King of Wessex. Although he was not as inclined towards learning as Alfred had been, Edward would go on to become a very capable king in his own right. Edward built up the size of his kingdom by reviving regions that had suffered terrible damage. Areas like East Anglia, Essex, and Northumbria were brought back to life, and Mercia was snatched back from Viking control. Under Edward, the forging of England as a unified kingdom had truly begun. Edward made a marriage for his daughter with the King of Northumbria in a further move to bring unity to the country. If and when the Northern King died, Edward could lay claim to that particular region. He added prestige to his slowly blossoming kingdom by marrying his daughter to Charles the Simple, King of France. One of his other daughters went on to marry the future Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Great, although that took place well after Edward had died. Although Mercia was not initially under his control, Edward's sister Athelflaed ruled it and ruled it quite capably. She rebuilt Tamworth and laid siege to Brecknock Castle, which was in the hands of the Britons. She claimed possession of Derby and Leicester, and when she died in 918, the Mercia which Edward became ruler of had been expanded through both her will and her guile. Athelflaed was a remarkable woman, and her part in the forging of England as a country should not be underestimated. Edward continued to move across the country and added to his kingdom. Buckinghamshire and Bedford were taken and fortified, although the Vikings continued to be problematic, attacking what had been peaceful for a short period places like Leicester and the new fortifications at Malden. Edward steadfastly continued on his building programme. Nottingham was also further strengthened. Edward's legacy is possibly slightly overlooked by the fact he was successor to Alfred the Great, but without him, as well as Athelflaed, the unification of England may have taken many centuries more, and quite possibly made for a different and distinctly more Danish-sounding country. Between he and his sister, Edward, through a combination of will, force, and diplomacy, began to build a more distinctively English country. While Alfred's biggest contribution to history was literacy, and more specifically the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Edward had changed the shape of the country geographically. Most of the country was under his possession by the time of his death, and whilst he probably cannot be called the first king of England quite yet, that opportunity will be left to his son Athelstan. Whilst he may be overshadowed, it is arguable that Edward had a greater impact on English history when compared to Alfred the Great. On the death of his father in 924, Athelstan became king of an ever-expanding territory, although still not the fully unified England as we know it today. One of his first actions as king was dealing with the Scots and their king, Constantine, who had reneged on a peace agreement. After seeking divine inspiration, Athelstan marched into Scotland and brutally restored peace. Constantine's son was brought down to Wessex to ensure the Scottish didn't go back on their word. In 927, Athelstan brought Northumbria into his possession, and he was effectively overlord of all the British kings, including Constantine. Evidently, that fact didn't count for too much, however, with the Scottish king, and Athelstan was obliged again to march into Scotland in 934 and lay waste to the countryside. It is evident from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that Scotland was proving particularly troublesome at this time, and the relationship between England and the Scots has not always been defined by English oppression of the Scots, and occasionally the Scots would attack England unprovoked. Constantine infringed upon English territory time and again through sheer opportunism. Perhaps he saw the expansion of the Wessex kingdom and thought he could claim further territory for himself. Athelstan was a pious man and frequently made gifts to places of worship whenever he was on campaign. It's also said he had a piece of the cross that Jesus was crucified on, although how many people claim to have such a fragment throughout the Middle Ages makes this seem quite dubious. Athelstan seems to have a good reputation around Europe, and accordingly received gifts from other monarchs and people of stature across the continent. The defining moment of not only Athelstan's reign, but one of the most important in Anglo-Saxon history, came towards the latter end of his reign in 937. The security of his kingdom faced its biggest threat at the Battle of Brunanburh, where a combined force of Danes, Irish, and unsurprisingly Scots attacked the kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of an emphatic victory for Athelstan as the Wessex men took no pity on the enemy. The Scots fell, the Danes were forced to flee back to their ships, and the Irish headed back to Ireland. Never was there seen to have been a bloodier battle on the island of Britain, and effectively established Athelstan as king of all England, although after his death his successors would continue to have some trouble bringing Northumbria back into line. By the time of his death in 939, Athelstan was what can be considered as the first true king of England. He had subdued his enemies with the single greatest victory, the Anglo-Saxons, at Brunanburh. He had brought Northumbria into his kingdom and had established himself as overlord of rival kings, although that didn't count for much as the Scots in particular rebelled time and again. Although it will be left to kings after him to put out the last flames of resistance to a unified English kingdom, Athelstan had effectively finished the job that had been started by his father and grandfather.